specifically a question or something I wanted to bring up, not to interrupt you, but it's pretty amazing. It's pretty amazing that he never got. I don't think he ever spent any time in a prison cell.
No, they don't touch it.
Which is just amazing because he was notoriously anytime that they wanted to search his apartment, I'm sure they'd find all sorts of illegal drugs, and I mean they had many reasons to toss him in the cellar or in a cell for his whole life.
Well, it goes back to that little sentence that jumped out of that MID report, is that he was an employee of the British government. That's why they didn't touch him.
Right.
In fact, here's something that when I was writing the book, it was a little detail. It was one of those little factoids that I couldn't run down, but which I have since. So it has to do with it when Crowley goes back to England at the end of 1919. I think in the book I say that we know when he gets to England and when he leaves, and it's either going to be this ship he went on or another ship he went on. And one of the problems was that I couldn't locate the passenger manifest to one of these ships. Ship called the Lapland, for whatever that's worth.
Yeah.
And eventually I found it, and the whole thing is that it actually was misfiled. Things happen. But I found, and there he is. And this is the thing. So he actually returned to England in December 1919, having spent those years in the U.S. writing pro-German propaganda. He returns under his own name.
Right.
There's no disguise, and furthermore, he had to be carrying a British passport because of wartime regulations, and that wasn't the passport that he would have gone over on, because that would have had to have been changed, which means that the British consulate in New York approved his return.
Right. And
so
was there a law at that time that he could have gone to prison, like for treason or whatever, for what he was writing in the States?
I've talked with people about who know their way around British law, and going back to that period. It's not quite as cut and dried as it would have seemed. They would have had to have made. They could have tried to have made a treason case against him. Whether they could have, because it's based purely upon what it was that he was writing, and you might say that it was inflammatory and it was in bad taste. What he didn't do, as far as I know, in any of these, was to directly attempt to subvert the loyalty of the armed forces, or advocate the defeat of the country, although he comes very close to saying that. Given the circumstances, I mean, a lawyer can parse this. On the other hand, what everyone pretty much agreed on is that in the immediate post-war environment, if his publications had been brought in for a British court, and he would have been convicted of something.
Right. Okay. That's all I wanted to know. I mean, if he would have been brought before a court, he probably would have done some time for that.
Yes, they could have made things very unpleasant, or he would never have dared. And notice the thing is that he goes back to England when he leaves the U.S.
Right.
He doesn't go to. This isn't hide out. So he goes to the passport, what was called the passport control office at the British consulate, and this is the little detail that's always good. And guess what agency oversaw the passport control office? Intelligence. Okay, passport. In this period, the passport control office was the front for MI6.
Okay.
All right. So those two things are all. I mean, the passport control office did just basic passport work, but it's also what MI6 was sort of hiding behind.
Right.
In most of these. So they knew fully what he was doing. If they wanted to arrest him or quite, they don't do anything to him. And
didn't he? I think you actually quoted him as saying something like. In his smug way, saying something to the effect that he asked them to give him any, he basically asked to be arrested if they had anything against him. Almost offered himself up just to.
Well, at one point, in fact, during the war, this is around 1917, and he's upset about something, which a part of it is he doesn't think he's being paid enough, and they always had money problems.
Right.
But he actually makes this threat that I went to the, he goes to the British Embassy in Washington, D.C. to complain. And that's also kind of interesting, that he walks into the embassy in Washington, D.C., even though he had this reputation of being a German propaganda, a quasi-traitor. And he makes it say that I was going to go to Canada and force them to arrest me.
Right.
And what that seems to mean is that, remember, the Canadian government is separate. All of his writings, anything that he had written, had been banned in Canada. The fatherland was banned in Canada. He was on a list in Canada of sort of, enemy propagandists.
Right.
So even though British authorities in the U.S. knew what he was doing, if he went to Canada and exposed himself, they would have arrested him. The Canadian authorities would probably have arrested him. And then what that would have done is that it would have embarrassed people in London or in Washington who would have had to go to the Canadians and explain to them what he was doing and get him out. And that's basically what he's threatening to do, is to embarrass British officials by getting himself arrested in Canada.
Right.
Again, later he is, violently attacked in the British press. Which is actually, he returns to England right after the war. He doesn't stay there very long, and I think the reason for that is that he's told that really you can't show your face around here because there are people in the press. He had this particular enemy among the British press barons, a guy by the name of Horatio Bottomley.
Right.
And Bottomley just sort of went out. He was driven to near hysteria by Crowley and what he did. And so he very quickly leaves and goes to France, or of course he meets his old buddy Everard Fielding, and more hijinks ensue. But that's the British officialdom, or at least certainly had, let's say, the security services were not going to touch him, but they didn't want him in the country because his mere presence there would excite Bottomley and other people in the press. What if they start asking questions?
Right.
And then what they, of course, and what no intelligence agency would want to get forced into the position of doing is to avowing, to really stepping out in public and go, this most wickedest man in the world, well, he actually works for us. Right.
Can we kind of right now get into his presence in Italy and the Abbey of Thelema in Cefalù, because that seems to be a perfect way cover, the Abbey's presence there kind of co-opts his ability to spy on not only Mussolini's Italy, but also I think there was something about him spying for France about ships coming in and out.
Or spying. Well, this is one of those things that, again, all of these little rumors sort of float around. And they were told that, again, in 1920, apparently, and I think most of this was on his own end. He wanted to form his own religion, his own church, and so he bought this farmhouse on the north coast of Sicily and invited some of his followers, a couple of girlfriends and their kids and some other people to which it sounds a lot like a hippie commune, actually.
Yeah.
The 1920s version of that. So he sort of forms his commune, his Abbey of Thelema in Sicily. But here again, it's one of those things that you find about anytime he shows up in a place, there's usually some real, or at least potential, intelligence value to it.
Right.
So he shows up there, and of course, in the course of his time, Mussolini takes over in 1922. The fascist government comes in. Fascist government is not keen on a lot of things, and they're not keen on Freemasons, Rosicrucians, or any other sort of weird cults operating in their territory.
Right.
But initially they sort of leave him alone. So the various sort of rumors about the intelligence aspect is that, one, that he was actually working for French military intelligence, spying on Italian naval installations around Palermo. Another was that, no, he was spying for the British, which is what I think is probably more correct, his usual employers, against the French. Because one of the things he would do in Sicily is that he'd make these trips back to Paris, and he'd make these trips to North Africa, to Tunis and Bizerte. And Bizerte was a very important French naval base in the Mediterranean, but it was also something else. It was the point from which French troops in North Africa were being sent to the Middle East. The French had taken over Syria, and there were a lot of British-French tensions in that area of the world. And so one of the things the British were quite interested in was, what the French were, the forces the French were sending or might be sending into Syria. And that also fits back in, guess where his buddy Everard Fielding had been spent most of the latter part of World War I? Syria, in the Middle East. And who was it that he reconnects with in Paris shortly before he takes off and establishes his Sicilian commune? Everard Fielding.
Wow. I
don't know. This is the type of thing you look at it and you figure, are those all coincidences, or is there a certain chain of events here?
Right.
Go ahead.
There was one thing, I don't know if this is going to lead us off topic or not, but there was a curious detail that jumped out at me, was that there's this woman, Violet Gibson, who tried to assassinate Mussolini. And you said in the book that it seemed to somebody at the time that she was there was some post-hypnotic suggestion going on with that?
Well, I think it's something that was claimed at her defense in the trial. Violet Gibson, again, she's English or Anglo-Irish. I think she actually turns out, this is about the same period that Ireland had gotten its independence or quasi-independence. But she takes a shot at Mussolini, misses him, and goes on trial in Italy. But it's one of these cases where it was sort of assumed at the time that there was more behind. It's the classic sort of lone nut. Was this just a sort of strange woman who came from Ireland to kill Il Duce, or was there something more to it than that? Right. And there are these. I mean, she's got connections to the Theosophists.
Yeah.
And that's another group which seems to have that really would sort of lead us off topic. Theosophy, I mean, I don't know what all the wonderful Theosophists are doing today. They want to draw any aspersions, but in the 20s, and particularly under the leadership of Annie Besant, who was again connected to the Indian independence movement, Theosophy had ties to, well, not just the sort of seditious movements within the British Empire, but because of that, to some degree, with Soviet influences. There's a lot of currents moving through there.
Right.
And
the Nazis also drew heavily on theosophical ideas. Not to paint the Theosophists with that, but,
Well, again, I don't want to draw too many connections between what was going on in an organization, decades ago and one now.
Right.
But it's one of the things, that if you're interested in those movements, if you're someone today who's interested in Theosophy, or it's like the Golden Dawn, it's not just all rituals and mystic knowledge. There's almost always some kind of a political dimension to these groups. And again, Annie Besant is a very political woman. She had very definite, strong, and radical opinions. The British government, considered her to be basically a dangerous subversive, and she was certainly someone they would want to keep an eye on. And Crowley, and hanging around, he's never a Theosophist himself, but in his connections with him, I think that's basically what he's doing. The Violet Gibson case is one of those things that, I don't, there are all of these other ramifications to it. The Theosophist connection, the intimations that in some way, if British intelligence was sort of watching what was going on, and I think that's something. I think the role that Crowley had in that, as elsewhere, to the extent he had an intelligence role in Italy in that period, was basically just to be a set of eyes and ears.
Right.
That again, I kind of I mean, one of the things that he knew by this time, or they assumed that he ought to know, was that he was experienced enough and intelligent enough to know what kind of